1689 to 1901. 1689, Parliament draws up the Declaration of Right detailing the unconstitutional acts of King James II. James' daughter and her husband, his nephew, become joint sovereigns of Britain as King William III and Queen Mary II. Parliament passes the Bill of Rights. Toleration Act grants rights to Trinitarian Protestant dissenters. Catholic forces loyal to James II land in Ireland from France and lay siege to Londonderry. 1690, King William defeats the Irish and French armies of his father-in-law at the Battle of the Boyne in Ireland. 1691. The Treaty of Limerick allows Catholics in Ireland to exercise their religion freely, but severe penal laws soon follow. The French War begins. 1692. The Glencoe Massacre occurs. 1694, Death of Queen Mary, King William now rules alone. Foundation of the Bank of England. Triennial Act sets the maximum duration of a parliament to 3 years. 1695, Lapse of the Licensing Act. 1697, Peace of Ryswick between the allied powers of the League of Augsburg and France ends the French War. Civil List Act votes funds for the maintenance of the royal household. 1701. The Act of Settlement settles the royal succession on the Protestant descendants of Sophia of Hanover. Death of the former King James II in exile in France. The French king recognizes James II's son as King James III. King William forms a grand alliance between England, Holland and Austria to prevent the union of the Spanish and French crowns. The War of the Spanish Succession breaks out in Europe over the vacant throne. 1702, Death of King William III in a riding accident. He is succeeded by his sister-in-law, Queen Anne. England declares war on France as part of the War of the Spanish Succession. 1704, British, Dutch, German and Austrian troops, under the Duke of Marlborough, defeat the French and Bavarians at the Battle of Blenheim. British, Bavarian and Austrian troops under Marlborough defeat the French at the Battle of Ramillies, and expel the French from the Netherlands. The British capture Gibraltar from Spain. 1707, the Act of Union unites the kingdoms of England and Scotland and transfers the seat of Scottish government to London. 1708, the Duke of Marlborough defeats the French at the Battle of Oudenarde. The French incur heavy losses. Queen Anne vetoes a parliamentary bill to recognise the Scottish militia. This is the last time a bill is vetoed by the sovereign. 1709, Marlborough defeats the French at the Battle of Malplaquet. 1710, a Tory ministry is formed, under Harley, with the impeachment of Dr. Sackville and the fall of the Whig government. 1713, the Treaty of Utrecht is signed by Britain and France, thus concluding the War of the Spanish Succession. 1714, Death of Queen Anne at Kensington Palace. She is succeeded by her distant cousin, the Elector George of Hanover, as King George I. A new parliament is elected with a strong Whig majority, led by Charles Townshend and Robert Walpole. 1715, the Jacobite rebellion begins in Scotland with the aim of overthrowing the Hanoverian succession and placing the old pretender, James II's son, on the throne. The rebellion is easily defeated. 1716, the Septennial Act sets general elections to be held every 7 years. 1717, Townshend is dismissed from government by George I, causing Walpole to resign. The Whig party is split. Convocation is suspended. 1719, South Sea bubble bursts, leaving many investors ruined after speculating with stock of the South Sea Company. 1721, Sir Robert Walpole returns to government as First Lord of the Treasury. He remains in office until 1742 and effectively becomes Britain's first Prime Minister. 1722, Death of the Duke of Marlborough. The Jacobite Atterbury plot is hatched. 1726, first circulating library in Britain opens in Edinburgh. Jonathan Swift publishes his Gulliver's Travels. 1727, Death of great British scientist, Sir Isaac Newton and of King George I, in Hanover. The latter is succeeded by his son as King George II. 1729, Alexander Pope publishes his Dunsad, 1730. A split occurs between Walpole and Townshend, 1732. A royal charter is granted for the founding of Georgia in America, 1733. The excise crisis occurs and Walpole is forced to abandon his plans to reorganize the customs and excise. 1737, death of King George II's wife, Queen Caroline. 1738, John and Charles Wesley start the Methodist movement in Britain. 1739, Britain goes to war with Spain in the War of Jenkins' Ear. The cause, Captain Jenkins' ear was claimed to have been cut off during a naval skirmish. 1740, commencement of the War of Austrian Succession in Europe. 1742, Walpole resigns as Prime Minister. 1743, George II leads British troops into battle at Dettingen in Bavaria. 1744, Ministry of Pelham. 1745, Jacobite rebellion in Scotland led by Bonnie Prince Charlie. There is a Scottish victory at Prestonpans. 1746, the Duke of Cumberland crushes the Scottish Jacobites at the Battle of Culloden. 1748, the Peace of Aix-la-Chapelle brings the War of Austrian Succession to a close. 1751, death of Frederick, Prince of Wales. His son, Prince George, becomes heir to the throne. 1752, adoption of the Gregorian calendar in Britain. 1753, Parliament passes the Jewish Naturalization Bill. 1754, the Ministry of Newcastle. 1756, Britain, allied with Prussia, declares war against France and her allies, Austria and Russia. The 7 Years' War begins. 1757, the Pitt-Newcastle Ministry. Robert Clive wins the Battle of Plassey and secures the Indian province of Bengal for Britain. William Pitt becomes Prime Minister. 1759, Wolfe captures Quebec and expels the French from Canada. 1760, death of King George II. He is succeeded by his grandson as George III. 1761, Lawrence Sterne publishes his Tristram Shandy. 1762, the Earl of Bute is appointed Prime Minister. He becomes very unpopular and employs a bodyguard. 1763, Peace of Paris ends the 7 Years' War. Grenville Ministry. 1765, Rockingham Ministry. The American Stamp Act raises taxes in the colonies in an attempt to make their defense self-financing. 1766, Chatham Ministry. Repeal of the American Stamp Act. 1768, Grafton Ministry. The Middlesex election crisis occurs. 1769, James Watt patents the steam engine. 1769–70, Captain James Cook's first voyage to explore the Pacific. 1770, Lord North begins service as Prime Minister. The Falkland Island crisis occurs. Edmund Burke publishes his thoughts on the present discontents. 1771, the Encyclopaedia Britannica is first published. 1773, American colonists protest at the East India Company's monopoly over tea exports to the colonies, at the so-called Boston Tea Party. The world's first cast iron bridge is constructed over the River Severn at Coal Brookdale. 1774, Parliament passes the Coercive Acts in retaliation for the Boston Tea Party. 1775, American War of Independence begins when colonists fight British troops at Lexington. James Watt further develops his steam engine. 1776, on 4th July, the American Congress passes their Declaration of Independence from Britain. Edward Gibbons publishes his Decline and Fall and Adam Smith, his Wealth of Nations. 1779, the rise of Wyville's Association movement. 1780, the Gordon riots develop from a procession to petition Parliament against the Catholic Relief Act. 1781, the Americans obtain a great victory of British troops at the surrender of Yorktown. 1782, end of Lord North's time as Prime Minister. He is succeeded by Rockingham in his second ministry. Ireland obtains short-lived Parliament, 1783, Shelburne's ministry, followed by that of William Pitt the Younger. Britain recognizes American independence at the Peace of Versailles. Fox-North coalition established, 1784. Parliament passes the East India Act, 1785. Pitt's motion for parliamentary reform is defeated, 1786. The Eden Commercial Treaty with France is drawn up, 1788. George III suffers his first attack of madness, caused by porphyria, 1789. Outbreak of the French Revolution, 1790. Edmund Burke publishes his Reflections on the Revolution in France, 1791. James Boswell publishes his Life of Johnson and Thomas Paine. His Rights of Man, 1792. Coal gas is used for lighting for the first time. Mary Wollstonecraft publishes her Vindication of the Rights of Women, 1793. Outbreak of war between Britain and France. The Voluntary Board of Agriculture is set up. Commercial depression throughout Britain, 1795. The Speen-Hamland system of outdoor relief is adopted, making wages up to equal the cost of subsistence. 1796. Vaccination against smallpox is introduced. 1798. Introduction of a tax of 10% on incomes over £200. T.R. Malthus publishes his Essay on Population, 1799. Trade unions are suppressed. Napoleon is appointed first consul in France, 1799 to 1801. Commercial boom in Britain, 1800. Act of Union with Ireland unites Parliaments of England and Ireland, 1801. Close of Pitt the Younger's ministry. The first British census is undertaken, 1802. Peace with France is established. Peel introduces the first factory legislation, 1803. Beginning of the Napoleonic Wars. Britain declares war on France. Parliament passes the General Enclosure Act, simplifying the process of enclosing common land, 1805. Nelson destroys the French and Spanish fleets at the Battle of Trafalgar, but is killed in the process, 1808-14. Peninsular War to drive the French out of Spain, 1809-10. Commercial boom in Britain, 1810. Final illness of George III begins, 1811. Depression caused by orders of council. There are Luddite disturbances in Nottinghamshire and Yorkshire. The king's illness leads to his son, the Prince of Wales, becoming regent, 1812. Prime Minister Spencer Perceval is assassinated in the House of Commons by a disgruntled bankrupt, 1813. Jane Austen's Pride and Prejudice is published. The monopolies of the East India Company are abolished, 1815. The defeat of Napoleon Bonaparte at Waterloo marks the end of the Napoleonic Wars. Peace is established in Europe at the Congress of Vienna. The Corn Laws are passed by Parliament to protect British agriculture from cheap imports, 1815-17. Commercial boom in Britain, 1817. Economic slump in Britain leads to the Blanketeers' March and other disturbances, 1818. Death of the King's wife, Queen Caroline. Mary Shelley publishes her Frankenstein, 1819. Troops intervene at a mass political reform meeting in Manchester, killing and wounding 400 people at the Peterloo Massacre, 1820. Death of the blind and deranged King George III. He is succeeded by his son, the Prince Regent, who becomes King George IV. A radical plot to murder the cabinet, known as the Cato Street Conspiracy, fails. Trial of Queen Caroline, in which George IV attempts to divorce her for adultery, 1821. Queen Caroline is excluded from the coronation, 1821-23. Famine in Ireland, 1823. The Royal Academy of Music is established in London. The British Museum is extended and extensively rebuilt to house an expanding collection, 1824. The National Gallery is established. Commercial boom in Britain, 1825. Nash reconstructs Buckingham Palace. The world's first railway service, the Stockton and Darlington Railway opens. Trade unions are legalized. Commercial depression in Britain. 1828. The Duke of Wellington becomes British Prime Minister. 1829. The Metropolitan Police Force is set up by Robert Peel. Parliament passes the Catholic Relief Act, ending most restrictions on Catholic civil rights. They are allowed to own property and run for public office, including Parliament. 1830. Death of King George IV at Windsor. He is succeeded by his brother, William IV. Opening of the Liverpool and Manchester Railway. Rise of the Whigs, under Grey. 1830–32, First major cholera epidemic in Britain. 1831. Swing riots in rural areas against the mechanization of agricultural activities. The new London Bridge is opened over the River Thames. 1832, the first or Great Reform Act is passed. This climax of a period of political reform extends the vote to a further 500,000 people and redistributes parliamentary seats on a more equitable basis. 1833, abolition of slavery throughout the British Empire. Parliament passes the Factory Act, prohibiting children aged less than 9 from working in factories, and reducing the working hours of women and older children. Start of the Oxford movement in the Anglican Church. 1834, Parliament passes the Poor Law Act, establishing workhouses for the poor. Robert Owen founds the Grand National Consolidated Trade Union. The government acts against illegal oaths in such unionism, resulting in the Tolpuddle martyrs being transported to Australia. Fire destroys the Palace of Westminster. 1835, Parliament passes the Municipal Reform Act, requiring members of town councils to be elected by ratepayers and councils to publish their financial accounts. 1835–36, commercial boom with little railway mania across Britain. 1837, death of King William IV at Windsor. He is succeeded by his niece, Victoria. Births, deaths and marriages must be registered by law. Charles Dickens publishes Oliver Twist, drawing attention to Britain's poor. 1838, the Anti-Corn Law League is established. Publication of the People's Charter. The start of Chartism. 1839, Chartist riots take place. 1840, Queen Victoria marries Prince Albert of Saxe-Coburg-Gotha. The penny post is instituted. 1841, the first British census recording the names of the populace is undertaken. The Tories come to power. Sir Robert Peel becomes Prime Minister. 1844, Parliament passes the Bank Charter Act. Foundation of the Rochdale Cooperative Society and the Royal Commission on the Health of Towns. 1844–45, railways mania explodes across Britain. Massive investment and speculation leads to the laying of 5,000 miles of track. 1845–49, Irish potato famine kills more than 1 million people. 1846, end of Sir Robert Peel's ministry. Whigs come to power. Repeal of the Corn Laws. 1848, major Chartist demonstration in London. Revolutions in Europe. Parliament passes the Public Health Act. 1851, the Great Exhibition is staged in Hyde Park. Thanks to Prince Albert, it is a great success. 1852, death of the Duke of Wellington. Derby's first minority Conservative government. Aberdeen's coalition government is established. 1853, vaccination against smallpox is made compulsory. Queen Victoria uses chloroform during birth of Prince Leopold. Gladstone presents his first budget. 1854, the Northcote Trevelyan Civil Service Report is published. The Crimean War begins, as Britain and France attempt to defend European interests in the Middle East against Russia. 1855, end of Aberdeen's coalition government. Palmerston's first government comes to power. 1856, Crimean War comes to an end. The Victoria Cross is instituted for military bravery. 1857–58, the Second Opium War opens China to European trade. The Indian Mutiny erupts against British rule on the subcontinent. 1858, Derby establishes his second minority government. Parliament passes the India Act, 1859, end of Derby's second minority government. Palmerston brings his second Liberal government to power. Charles Darwin publishes his The Origin of the Species, 1860. Gladstone's budget and the Anglo-French Cobden Treaty codifies and extends the principles of free trade, 1861. Death of Prince Albert, Prince Consort, 1862. Parliament passes the Limited Liability Act in order to provide vital stimulus to accumulation of capital in shares. 1863, Edward, Prince of Wales, marries Princess Alexandra of Denmark. The Salvation Army is founded. 1865, death of Palmerston. Russell establishes his second Liberal government. 1866, Russell and Gladstone failed to have their moderate reform bill passed in Parliament. Derby takes power in his third minority Conservative government. 1867, Derby and Disraeli's second reform bill doubles the franchise to 2 million. Canada becomes the first independent dominion in the British Empire under the Dominion of Canada Act. 1868, Disraeli succeeds Derby as Prime Minister. Gladstone becomes Prime Minister for the first time. 1869, the Irish Church is disestablished. The Suez Canal is opened. 1870, primary education becomes compulsory in Britain through the Forster-Ripon English Elementary Education Act. Parliament also passes the Women's Property Act, extending the rights of married women, and the Irish Land Act. 1871, trade unions are legalized. 1872, secret voting is introduced for elections. Parliament passes the Scottish Education Act, 1873. Gladstone's government resigns after the defeat of their Irish Universities Bill. Disraeli declines to take up office instead. 1874, Disraeli becomes Conservative Prime Minister for the second time. 1875, Disraeli purchases a controlling interest for Britain in the Suez Canal. Agricultural depression increases. 1875–76, Parliament passes R.A. Cross's Conservative Social Reforms. 1876, Queen Victoria becomes Empress of India. The massacre of Christians in Turkish Bulgaria leads to anti-Turkish campaigns in Britain, led by Gladstone. 1877, Confederation of British and Boer States established in South Africa. 1878, the Congress of Berlin is held. Disraeli announces peace with honour. 1879, a trade depression emerges in Britain. The Zulu War is fought in South Africa. The British are defeated at Isandlwana, but are victorious at Ulundi. 1879–80, Gladstone's Midlothian campaign denounces imperialism in South Africa and Afghanistan. 1880, Gladstone establishes his second Liberal government. 1880–81, the First Anglo-Boer War is fought. 1881, Parliament passes the Irish Land and Coercion Acts. 1882, Britain occupies Egypt. A triple alliance is established between Germany, Austria and Italy. 1884, Parliament passes the Third Reform Act which further extends the franchise. 1885, death of General Gordon at Khartoum. Burma is annexed. Salisbury succeeds Gladstone with his first minority Conservative government. Parliament passes the Redistribution Act. 1886, Gladstone's third Liberal government fails to pass its first Irish Home Rule Bill through the House of Commons. Gladstone resigns as Prime Minister. Split in the Liberal Party. Salisbury establishes his second Conservative Liberal Unionist government. The Royal Niger Company is chartered. Gold is discovered in the Transvaal. 1887, Queen Victoria celebrates her Golden Jubilee. The Independent Labour Party is founded. The British East Africa Company is chartered. 1888, the County Councils Act establishes representative county-based authorities. 1889, London Dockers strike. The British South Africa Company is chartered. 1892, Gladstone forms his fourth Liberal government. 1893, Second Irish Home Rule Bill fails to pass the House of Lords. 1894, Rosebery takes power with his minority Liberal government. 1895, Salisbury forms his third Unionist ministry. 1896, the British conquest of the Sudan begins. 1897, Queen Victoria celebrates her Diamond Jubilee. 1898, British rule over Sudan fully established. German naval expansion begins. 1899, British disasters in South Africa. 1899 to 1902, Boer War in South Africa. 1900, Salisbury wins the khaki election. The Labour Representation Committee is formed. Parliament passes the Commonwealth of Australia Act. 1901, death of Queen Victoria. She is succeeded by her son, Prince Albert, as King Edward VII.